Well, good afternoon. First of all, thanks for joining us today. I'm going to talk a little bit about our crime stats today, and then as Scott had mentioned, Ron will give some of the statistical analysis, and then we'll be open for questions to discuss what some of the reasons might be and some of the things that we need to do going forward. So the recently released annual crime statistics show that Edmonton maintained a consistent ranking in most major crime statistic categories between 2021 and 2022. The annual StatsCan numbers outline similar concerns for most large cities across Canada, and of course our city is not an exception to that. The level of violence that many of our cities are experiencing is a national issue and not an anomaly being experienced by a few metropolitan communities. And while we are pleased that Edmonton's crime numbers are somewhat better than some other large cities across Canada, I want to be very, very clear that our increasing violent crime rate in Edmonton remains quite alarming. The randomness surrounding an increased number of violent incidents in Edmonton can't be ignored, as we've discussed many times in some of our recent conferences and Q&As. These incidents, including tragic events such as the random murders of a mother and a daughter in May in Crawford Plains, both innocent victims, show the growing intersection between our healthcare and our justice system. They also review glaring gaps in our current social and support services, which can and have led to other life-altering outcomes for so many victims, their families, and their friends. While crime was higher in some categories back in the 1990s, the critical level of violence and weapons that we are seeing today is beyond comparison. Without question, we are at a crossroads in Canada. With the convergence of these societal complexities, and the situation must be immediately addressed if we expect to return to appropriate levels of safety in our communities. This is why, certainly in the previous, the Edmonton Police Service, along with the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, continue to advocate for reforms of our bail system and the improved integrations of supports and services offered by law enforcement, government, and community partners. We continue to do our best work vigorously and efficiently with our partners in and out of law enforcement, and certainly our community to impact the change required for our families to enjoy their city and to not have to live in fear each day. I'm going to turn it over, as I mentioned, to Ron Anderson, our Chief Innovation and Technology Officer, who is going to help break down some of the crime stats. And then both Ron and I will get into some detailed Q&A with you shortly. So, Ron?
Thanks, Chief, and good afternoon, everybody. What I'm going to walk through with you today is a bit of a high-level summary of the 2022 statistics from StatsCan's perspective, but primarily from the Edmonton Police Service and municipality perspective. So as we go through, there are a few terms that are important to understand when looking at crime stats. The first is, of course, the Crime Severity Index, which is highlighted greatly in the StatsCan report. That measurement is a combination of a relative severity of each crime that has a sliding scale, which I'll show you shortly, as well as the volume of crime that takes place in the community. The second important thing to remember is the crime rate, and that is the number of crimes that take place per 100,000 population within the city of Edmonton. So the Crime Severity Index has a sliding scale ranging from 1, essentially, all the way up to 7,656 as a score, and that's aggregated over the course of a year. So as your year goes by, the Crime Severity Index rises as crimes are committed, and the more serious the crimes, the higher the score goes as you move throughout the year. So I'll touch on some of that as we move a little bit forward, but I want to give you an idea that not all crimes are created equal, and there's a larger harm to the public in certain types of crimes. So when we report on Crime Severity Index, it is dealing with the harm in the community. When we report on volume or the rate, we're talking about the number of people or businesses that are harmed in the year. The StatsCan report speaks about speaks about central metropolitan areas. Those are larger than the city of Edmonton. So if you're looking at the report that StatsCan released last Friday, that report speaks to the CMA, which includes all of the area around the city of Edmonton. What we're going to show you today is from the data tables behind that, from StatsCan, and those come directly from the EPS and speak only to the city of Edmonton or municipality of Edmonton itself. It doesn't include the outliers. So some of the numbers you may see today will be slightly different than what you saw in the StatsCan report because we are a large contributor to the CMA, but we are not the same thing. So from the City of Edmonton's perspective, the total crime severity increased by 5% or plus 5 between 2021 and 2022. All these slides you'll receive at the end of the session, so I'm going to move through them relatively quickly as we go. What makes up those CSI ratings in the city? Primarily, you're looking at these top 10s as the drivers for the CSI in the City of Edmonton. So breaking and entering, robbery, theft, etc., going down. All the way to crimes that only take place rarely. The total crime rate increased by 8% or an extra 653 occurrences between 2021 and 2022. Again, that's a number of crimes per 100,000. You'll note the last few years we had a downward trend, and then we've turned it around, unfortunately, in the wrong direction this year. Last year we had made a different path than most of the large cities in Canada, but we appear to be attaching to the same types of numbers we're seeing elsewhere, as the chief had mentioned. The drivers for the volume there are these items. So a lot of thefts, a lot of your shopliftings, assault level 1s, motor vehicle frauds and thefts. These are high volume incidents, and quite often these are the repeat offenders that we deal with on a regular basis in our community. Some of these items, of course, have multiple occurrences attached to a single individual, such as liquor store thefts or other theft from vehicles, etc. The violent crime severity essentially remained unchanged from last year. So remember, this is the relative severity number. This does not equate to the volume of violent crime, which I'll speak to shortly. But essentially, we've been relatively flat for the severity of our crime over the last few years. And these are the violent crime severity drivers, robbery being number 1, assault level 2, and assault level 1 making up the primary drivers behind our crime severity index on the violent side. Unfortunately, our violent crime went up 13% between 2021 and 2022. And I will show you, unfortunately, at the end of this slide, that it continues in an upward trend in 2023 as well. And you've seen a number of random or violent incidents take place over the last few months. And unfortunately, these are something that we really need to get on top of as partners in the community and as other parts of the justice system as well. These are the top 10 violent crime drivers by volume. You'll see assault level 1 and assault level 2, and you'll notice a large difference between 2021 and 2022. It was over 1,000 assault level 1s increase in 2022 as there was in 2021. And I note at the bottom there, I want to make sure we understand, when we have an assault or we have a crime against person, every one of those has at least one victim attached. So when we say there's 15,000 victims in the City of Edmonton last year, that's 15,000 people impacted by that incident or those incidents, along with their families or their coworkers or anybody else who's associated with those files. When we speak about statistics, I know we get lost in the numbers sometimes, but these are people behind these items. They aren't just a number within a deck, and they aren't just a number in a news story that goes by. They're people whose lives go on, and they're traumatized by the incidents that take place over the course of time. On the nonviolent side, the severity of nonviolence went up 7% last year. These are items that are property crimes or other crimes that involve the thefts, etc. Breaking and enterings, number 1, theft 5,000. These are the drivers in the community, unfortunately, for property-related crime. And in this case, this is the volume and the difference between the 2 years. So we see a continuing trend for theft 5,000 under, with a difference of 2,600 incidents last year. We had seen a downturn in this during the pandemic, largely related to shoplifting being down because stores were closed, as well as liquor stores, et cetera, over that period of time. Unfortunately, we're seeing them return back to 2019 numbers at this point. Again, these are largely individuals that are repeat offenders in the community. So to summarize 2022, you'll see an increase of 5% and 8% in the crime severity and the rate, respectively. Our violent CSI essentially remained unseen, but the volume was much higher. The drivers of Edmonton's violent crime rate are, again, assaults, robberies, and extortions. And in 2022, there were 15,180 victims of violent crime. That's an 18% increase year over year. So now I'll give you a brief summary of 2023. We do have detailed slides behind this, which you'll receive afterwards, but for brevity, 2023's numbers are at this point not finalized, and they go up till the end of June of this year. These items will change up to 2 months after due to investigations taking time to conclude. So just what you see today on 2023 are preliminary numbers at this point. So in the first 6 months of 2023, the trend of violent crime continues to increase, with 12% crime severity going up over last year, largely driven by the shootings and the assaults that we have unfortunately seen in the media and been investigating. In the first 6 months, there were 7,984 victims of violent crime in the city. That is an increase of 8%, or about 609 additional victims over this time last year. And this goes till the end of June, so the first 6 months of the year. The nonviolent crime severity in Edmonton decreased by 9% in the first 6 months compared to the previous year. And the decrease in nonviolent crime in Edmonton is driven largely by decreases in thefts from motor vehicles. So citizens are paying attention to what's in their vehicles, less opportunity, less crime, as well as break-and-enters and shoplifting are also down, along with fail-to-appears. So that will conclude the presentation. We open it up for questions to either myself or Chief McPhee.
Questions?
Chief, a couple of weeks ago, we heard from an inspector talking about safety downtown and how essentially that people aren't safe. Can you talk about that? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what he basically said is to be cautious, and obviously this is how, and that was due to the nature of the randomness of that particular assault. But let's talk about the stats overall here in relation to some of the things. Can you go back to Ron, slide 12?
Yep.
Just remind everybody to use the mic when they're asking a question, please. This is where
Yeah. What's interesting here, and this is what we've been telling you members of the media for quite some time, when we started our change in 2019, we actually started to beat the average and get underneath the Canadian rates. But there's basically probably 4 things that I think we can say that are really impacting a crime, which are specific to what you're talking about downtown. You've heard our vocal piece on bail reform, and the reality is many of these offenders that are actually have been on some type of release over the course of 2 years, 26 homicides, and that continues. And pretty much most files, and I would say most files that are creating this grievous bodily harm to others, are people that are out on some type of release or have a significant history. The interesting part of that, StatsCan, with both Ron and I played a part on for several years, did several studies saying that serious violent offenders are responsible for up to 50% of reoffending in the criminal justice system. So if there's no accountability to that, it's going to disproportionately drive some of that. We're seeing that play out. The second thing that changed in relation to that time, right around the end of 2020, just getting into 2021, federal prosecutions also basically sent a memo to all police chiefs in Alberta saying that we are no longer going to prosecute simple drug possession. Now, the reality is that's not bad in some concepts, but if there's no consequences, then basically that particular activity is increased, and I think you just have to look down the street to see the rapid open-air drug use that we see, which makes it the fear go. But some of those drugs, like meth, make very normal people do unpredictable things. The third thing that actually ties into this graph, and I don't want to highlight or harp on this because you've heard me speak about this one many times too, that's the same time that we lost a whole bunch of resources in relation to people starting to had enough. They're leaving policing. We had a budget cut in relation to that. So we don't have some of the visibility that we once have, even though we're trying to find ways to do that. And then the fourth thing that is playing into that impact right now is we have tents everywhere with no accountability. And there's a disproportionate amount of violence driven in that particular period, and most of those, although not exclusively, in the downtown. So I think rather than me turn that into saying it's not safe, let's blame somebody, the reality is we are now in serious deliberation saying this has to stop and we need to change the way we actually deal with this. And if that means that we have to lead a significant portion of this, those are discussions we have. But the reality, it's no different than we talked about from 2019 and 2021. We had our biggest reductions. We had a lot of good partnerships. The point being, it's not working right now, and it needs a drastic change, and that's what we're prepared to do. So caution is exercised when it's somebody that you don't know or perhaps is acting in some different ways. I think that's only important to always use that caution due to some of the things that we're seeing in particular areas. But safety also is something that we want to try to ensure that is something that everybody in this city can take for granted. And right now, there's a lot of unpredictable things which we continue to work on, and we're going to change some of those approaches in it. So I haven't really answered your question about the safety directly, but I'm telling you all the things that I think have contributed to that. And I think it is time, at certain times, you actually have to exercise caution when it's not an environment you know, or perhaps that somebody is acting irrational. I encourage you to use that, whether it's a city in the world or not. It's just you've got people using different drugs that are absolutely mind-altering and making people do bad things.
Miriam with CTV. Just on that note, we're seeing more violence happening outside of downtown as well. You know, people are scared to go to a festival, pick up their kids from an event. And we're seeing from the numbers you just showed us of 2023, the violence going up. How concerned are you about that?
Well, again, as I said in the last question, is violence, it's the individuals. It's because, I mean, when we basically flood downtown, as we said before, when we did that, we expected it to be displaced. And when we took the resources from the outside and moved it to the perimeter, then we can't have the same impact when they actually move out. So our number one thing that we're trying to focus on right now is recruiting, because we need to get more bodies to actually, to your point, is people got to go somewhere, right? And that's what we're actually seeing. Now, it still is certain areas, not just downtown, that are disproportionately driving some of this. And those are the areas that we need to focus on. And to do that, we're going to focus on people and partnerships, the right partnerships. And honestly, we have to do something about what we tolerate. I mean, if you just tolerate open air drug use everywhere, it's probably not a good thing, I mean, especially when we have facilities such as safe consumption sites where people can use their drugs in a safe manner. And it's also not safe to camp in some of these environments that we're allowing happen here as well. So there's things within that strategy that we have to specifically address in different ways than we are today.
How many more bodies does EPS need to maybe address this a bit better?
Well, first of all, right now, due to, you know, certain things, let's call it some of the negativity, some of the burnout, some of the things like no different than some of the nurses and EMS workers have seen. We've seen a large exodus. I think we have 200 bodies currently off and another 78 vacancies. Now that we have the province that gave us some money, we're going to classes of 50. Our old classes were 32. So we hope within a few years that we can address it, but we hope within 3 classes a year we can start putting more bodies into these areas that need, better services in relation to visibility. But we're also going to tweak our structure to better reflect how we deal with the manner we're dealing with it, because these shortages of staffing are taking place everywhere right now. And we have to think and act differently, which we do, but you still can't substitute the fact that seeing an officer in the downtown core, as I get calls every day wanting more people. But to your whole point, I think you answered that question earlier. The only way I can find new people is if I take them from another area of the city, which are starting to see some of this growth as well. So it's an absolute priority for us.
Hi, Cindy Tran with the Edmonton Journal.
Hi, Cindy.
One of the stats that I saw on StatsCan was gang-related homicides accounted for a quarter of homicides in all of Canada. A vast majority of this was committed with a firearm or handgun. I'm wondering if you can talk about the prevalence of gang-related or organized crime activity within the city.
Well, it's interesting because you ask a really good, or you make some really good points. And I think in the last couple of years or 2.5 years, you know, when the Criminal Intelligence Agency is saying the gang involvement in fentanyl has gone up by 50%. Guess what? Overdoses have gone up. I mean, and people think that this is about safe drugs. Well, there's no safe drug. I mean, some of these drugs we're seeing on the street, xylazine, never even heard of this. They're veterinarian drugs. You know, carfentanil, that's for an elephant. There's no such thing as safe. The reality is when the gangs are involved, they really don't care how many people die. And I don't mean to be harsh on that, but the reality is we absolutely need to target those folks. We're also on the firearm scene, as Ron articulated, and you picked up on StatsCan, it's going through the roof. And what we need to do now is we've built out our lab, we've done some pretty progressive things in relation to that. We got to get a non-fatal shooting team, and each one of these gun files, people need to be held accountable. But it goes back to that whole thing. Some of these last offenders you've seen, they have triple firearms prohibition. Does that make sense to the average human being? Not the first one, not the second one, not the third one. So there also needs to be some reform that we're going to need. And now that we've got some voices, including the premiers of every province, that has to happen quickly. There needs to be some accountability. We get what we tolerate. If there's no accountability, then we shouldn't expect anything but chaos.
What's some of the work that EPS is doing right now to handle the firearms?
The non-fatal shooting, we have teams exclusively. We have a gangs team that's on the ground. We're working files. We're working with other agencies. We're actually looking at labs as well, because Canada, back to your point on gangs, Canada went from an importer of fentanyl to an exporter of fentanyl. That doesn't happen overnight. That takes a lot of organization, and a lot of organization fits that. So the alert model that the province has funded in relation to that is also getting strengthened so we can deal with those high-level investigations. We are putting more and more people into that, because when it comes to that type of violence, that needs to be addressed. And the only way to address that particular part is through the justice system.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bianca Millian,
Hey,
City
Bianca.
News. We mentioned at the beginning, this is a Canada-wide problem, although we're focused on Edmonton's stats today. So my question is two parts. One, is EPS in this alone, or can there be other cities to look to? And if there can be, is there a collaborative effort to be had to bring all this down?
It's a good question. It's actually the highlight of our conference that we're hosting from September 18th to 20th. So thanks for that plug. And what that conference is focused on is all these hot button issues and what can we learn from each other. For instance, one's on guns and gangs. Another is on transit, which might be a priority for us. Another one's on mental health and addictions and what's actually being done in relation to that. One's on politicization of policing. One's on reconciliation and all these alternative service delivery models, how we can take the vulnerable out of the justice system. So absolutely, we do this often, but this is going to be the first annual conference. It's going to go to Peel in Ontario next, and then we're going to go down to the States. We've already got confirmation from some major chiefs coming in, the chief of San Francisco, chief of Salt Lake City, chief of Dallas, chief of Boston looks like probably for sure, chief of Toronto, and I could go on. So we're bringing all of these things together to share practices, but it's also to share with other professionals on we have to do something different. But I want to also don't want to take away thinking that police alone are going to solve this. If we don't get some serious changes back to bail reform that we've discussed several times, if there's no accountability in the system, if everybody can do what they want, then you get what you're tolerating. And that's going to require change that's a lot bigger than the police. It's a lot bigger than changing legislation. It's also what are we going to accept? And I mean, there's not a day go by that I don't think I get a call from somebody in the business community that need help with this. We need visibility. We ran a volleyball tournament. I'm talking to a couple world-class volleyball players in the gym, and I asked them what's going on. And, and one was from the Netherlands, Amsterdam, and then the other was from Spain, and they're saying, what's going on in your city? And I mean, that's not okay. We take that personally, but we all need to take it personally. And it means we're lacking some accountability in the system here, and that's what we're going to advocate. And then with the powers we have, that's what we're going to act on. But we also know that's with empathy, and there's a lot of people that should not be in the justice system. And I think for the most part, we know who those are. But we're talking about criminals that are taking advantage of our disadvantaged.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Rod from City
Hey, Rod.
TV. Crimes are tangible, they're easy to put on a graph and easy to, distinguish. What about some of the underlying issues like the addiction that leads to crimes, like mental health that leads to crimes? What kind of work is being done behind the scenes?
Yeah, mental health and addictions are a great question. I mean, one of the key things, I think that I sat on the mental health and addictions task force for the province. There's been a lot of recommendations. I know the province is in the point of implementing, which includes, as we've talked about lots, you can't take an individual that's struggling and put them in a house and think that's going to fix it. There's a whole bunch of a path in relation to a system that's being built. They are. Some of these are these recovery communities. Some of it's going to be enforcement, as was mentioned, on the gangs that are obviously illicitly trafficking drugs. Some is going to be medical treatment. How do we relieve the hospitals? How do we get better partners with Radius Health? Radius Health is now running our old DMU. We've got Sublocade and Suboxone in our cell block, trying to get people from overdosing, get a health follow-up. The whole point is we're very dependent on that, and I'm actually encouraged where the province is going in relation to this. I mean, unfortunately, everybody wants it to be built tomorrow, including myself, but it takes time. I think what we'll see in the mental health addiction space in Alberta will be different than anywhere in the country within the next year. But unfortunately, we needed it 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago. But the next best time to start, and they have been at this for a while, and it's committed in their platform when re-elected. So I'm encouraged with that, but it's drastically needed too. And then, of course, we have HELP, which are police and social workers, which is showing a huge reduction, police and crisis workers, which were showing a huge reduction. And then we give a technology to all of our patrol officers called Health IM, which is actually allowing people to connect some of our people that we're dealing with to services in a quicker manner, just through a quick online assessment that they can do on their phones. So we've invested heavily in this area, just as we're investing heavily in guns and gangs.
Yes, is there any way to gauge those two issues, addictions and healthcare, in relation to those graphs? Is there any?
Well, I can tell you right now, meth plays a huge role in our violence. You can just ask any frontline patrol officer; they see it every day, and that's why, people that say that we need to send an alternative service delivery model, it all depends, because if it's somebody that's on meth, they're unpredictable. And if you see what's happening, or I don't know, and I'm pretty sure that most of you are in the downtown, have you ever seen somebody that's been given Narcan or naloxone, and then somebody that actually woke up and becomes extremely violent very quickly? That's drugs. So those are the things that we're dealing with on a daily basis. And I talked about the Bob, Charlie, Devin, Evan, and Frank. We just need better solutions to this. They're coming, but at the same time, to think it's just the justice system, no, you're 100% right. But if the justice system and the health system aren't working together, it's a missed opportunity.
Hi, Sam from CBC.
Hey, Sam.
You talked a lot about how you're hosting a conference, you're bringing a lot of chiefs of police together, and you're looking actively to other jurisdictions. Is there a model out there that's working really well that you can point to that you'd like to emulate in Edmonton?
It depends what you're looking at. I think Phoenix is doing some really cool stuff on the shooting and how they brought down their shootings, and it's through this non-fatal shooting team, better tracking data. Toronto's now incorporated how they use that data to deploy and check out on people. That's absolutely working. I think some of the stuff that came out of Portugal in relation to addictions has worked, but now there's some question in relation to that. I think what was missing in Portugal probably is the health piece of that. There's stuff in the UK in relation to that. There's lots of good alternative service delivery model. I mentioned our help, our PACT. We'll have Albuquerque, New Mexico here at the chief, and they'll be talking about what they're doing. We hopefully have Denver, their chief, talking about what they're doing. We're working on Eugene, Oregon, the CAHOOTS model, which everybody talks about. We're seeing some of that in Toronto. We're seeing some good youth stuff in Calgary that'll be here. Absolutely, all incorporated. That's what it's all about, right? As you know, it's best plagiarism is the highest form of flattery when you need to do something quickly, right? If something's working somewhere else, how do you tweak it, make it fit locally, and then make it a local solution? So right now we need to do all of that, and that's what this conference is built around.
Chief, you spoke about, obviously the actions police will take when and if there are changes to bail reform. But can you talk about changes that you guys are going to make right now?
Yeah,
immediately?
I would say you'll see us within the next, hopefully 6 weeks, change our approach to open air drug use. I mean, reality is it's still against the law. It doesn't mean they're going to go to jail, but we got to do something with the illicit drugs that are on the street that are killing people, that are creating violence. We got to do something differently. We got to figure out what that is, what the partners look like, who we do the referral to, who we get them connected to. But I can't no longer trip over somebody. Every day I leave this mall that's using meth, that's freaking out, and they're scaring people. And I mean, I think every other person that lives down here and works down here would say the same thing, but we have to do the right things. And that's what I want to make sure that we get right. But we're absolutely has to change the approach. Now, keep in mind, we still have a memo from federal prosecutions that they won't prosecute that in the justice system, but that isn't our only thing. So we have to find different options to deal with that. So that's one thing. I think we have to work with the city to do something different on the encampment space. I mean, my goodness, it's just moving from one block to the other. They're coming from everywhere. And I'm not sure when this became acceptable to the degree it is now, but we need to add our voice. I don't think we're the leader in that, but we're working with our partners in fire in the city in relation to that, because we have to. My concern from the chief and all the people in policing here, the level of violence that transpires in there, the normal human being doesn't know about, and it's not acceptable to leave people that are vulnerable in those situations.
And sorry, one more while I'm up here. I think the average Edmontonian is very concerned about the staggering amount of violent crime. And maybe it's not fatal, but these assaults that you guys are saying are drive. Can you talk about the random crime? And you say be careful, but be careful. We had someone stabbed walking to their car from Taste of Edmonton.
Yeah.
Like, what is that?
Well, and that's just it. We'll take the one that we talked about. The person should have been in jail. Most of them should have been in jail. They were charged multiple times. If you looked at our occurrences, we're looking at 193, 210 occurrences. So, I mean, the justice system exists for a reason, and we need to continue to press for that change. So what can we do in the interim, short term, before bail reform? We can work with the prosecutors to better assess who we should be afraid of and not who we're mad at. And the people that we're afraid of, honestly, jail was created for a reason, and it's a rehabilitation mechanism for people in custody that are not safe to be in a community when they rehabilitate. Doesn't mean they're in jail forever. It means they get a better chance to rehabilitate. Problem is you can't mix the low risk and the high risk, so we have to focus on that. I think there's good opportunity for us to push that with prosecutions. And, you know, that's what our courts were designed for. Our courts were designed for protecting us from the people that we're afraid of. And that afraid of comes from repetition of harm. And those are the people we're talking about. So that's also why we want to form the non-fatal shooting team, go after the guns, go after the gangs. But as you know, guns and gangs, when it comes to that, is also associated drugs. They're inseparable.
But what would you say to an Edmontonian who works downtown? Like, what does be cautious look like? How do you protect yourself?
Well, I think be cautious is, you know, don't go out of your way when you don't know the situation to become involved. Just go about your normal business. You know, some of the people that get harmed is when they actually try to help people. And, you know, if you're not equipped and not trained for that, I think it's dangerous. I think that's where you call police. If it's something that's out of the ordinary, it seems like it's escalating, that's our role to attend those calls, and it'll always be our role. We have a lot of resources down here. It's not like we don't have resources. We have a division, we have HSOC, you know, we got beats, we got a lot of people working in this particular area. So call when needed, and then the other part is just don't enter into an environment that you're not comfortable with. And again, you're seeing that the randomness is not just happening in Edmonton, it's happening in other parts too. And part of it comes to the lack of accountability. But what we need to do also to help that is we need to get more bodies and increase visibility.
Any other questions for Chief? Thank you.
Thanks very much, you guys.